Alright, so hey everyone. Today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for the SPRAWL 0 demo. This is being demonstrated on PC, on Steam, and specifically through an Xbox controller. I don't think this had support for PlayStation controllers, but just in case that makes a difference. But for movement, what we have is about a 20.5% bloated square dead zone, or bloated axial dead zone. However, the ratio is so biased towards the radial portion of the dead zone, it is almost completely round. This restricts diagonal movement just very slightly around the axes and just right around the dead zone. Though it's such a small amount, this isn't really noticeable. If I try to, say, line up the crosshair with that, you can see the corner of this wall. I just drift when passing over that axis. But for the movement curve, it starts out at a faster speed and then sort of flatlines there for a short bit of time before blending seemingly into a linear progression for the rest of the stick travel. This shaded region represents the sprint threshold. So if you try sprinting under this threshold, nothing will happen. And if you're over it, you'll be able to start sprinting. One thing is right on this border. If you're right on the border, sprinting will be sort of inconsistent. It seems to only allow you to stay sprinting if you're within a certain... If you're moving pretty forward, if you're making too large of angular movements, then it'll cancel it, sort of like what it did right there. And it's a pretty tight range, but otherwise, of course you're going to be pushing the stick fully, so that's not going to apply. It just seems to be very sensitive right at the edge of this threshold. But the real important stuff is for the camera. And what we have here is a 15% axial dead zone. However, you can see that there are dotted thresholds, or dashed thresholds, but well, first, there's a central 15% square shape because of that axial dead zone. But I've noticed when playing for a little while, the dead zone slightly increases and becomes sort of a slight rounded square shape. And the dead zone I've seen go from 15% to maybe about 18%. I don't know how much that affects the curves. I tested the curves when it was at about 17%, but the dead zone changing like that could have affected those tests. Anyway, the axial dead zones were, the axial dead zones across the board were functionally similar, so 15% around each axis is restricted. And you can see I can make these body motions and the camera's been moving perfectly horizontally. And you can only see diagonal movement once you break out of both axis dead zones, represented by this green region. And this is most obvious when looking straight at the ground and looking for horizontal movement. As far as the acceleration curve, they do have options for 3 of them, and I've only tested linear, and mainly because linear is just completely wrong. So and I imagine exponential and dynamic are similarly wrong. So linear is a very slow exponential curve, and there is an acceleration jump at the edge of stick movement. This acceleration jump seems to be relative to the global sensitivity. I didn't test all the sensitivity values, so it's not useful for that, but mainly linear is just completely wrong. But the curve itself seems to be set up per magnitude, so distance from the center rather than per each axis, and that's a good thing, but it's just extraordinarily slow. You can see that my stick can lean outside of this circular range, and it seems like that hasn't been capped in this. So my stick can't lean too far, but if your stick could lean to the edge, to the corners of the thumbstick module, you'd actually be able to turn faster diagonally than left or right or up or down. Now normally, or at least if you could do that, your perfect diagonals could be up to about 40% faster than your cardinal directions, left and right, up and down. That's normally indicative that a curve is being applied per axis. However, it seems like the curve tests I did implied that it was radial, and given how not subdued the angles are, it seems like it's radial. There's just probably the excess velocity is being clipped both horizontally and vertically to create that kind of square shape of your maximum diagonal acceleration. But the horizontal and vertical sensitivity seem to be the same at the same values, so that's consistent. But really what's needs to be corrected is first the curve. Linear is simply not linear, and exponential feels even slower than that. So this has been a common issue in many games, Call of Duty, the Finals, X-Defiant. There's some trend to just suppress whatever curves you're offering and making them slower than they should be. So that should be corrected so that linear is actually linear and exponential is a reasonable exponential. But also, while 3 options is fine, I'm really not a fan of presets over sliders. I think a slider controlling the degree of a power function, you could easily have 10 or more steps for that, ranging from linear to cubic, and that would give players far more customization than just 3 presets. So that would address the curve, and I think the curve is the biggest issue with this game right now, because it's so slow that it can feel like you really can only make very small movements and then very large movements. Your middle speeds are just very awkward to access, so your sort of like tracking movements are really difficult to access. Like shooting, longer distance, that's kind of fine, and just turning around, that's okay, but being able to access medium speeds is just very difficult with a curve this slow. But other things, other improvements that could be made, for movement, just remove this little angular restriction, or the small axial dead zone there. For the camera, swap out this axial dead zone for a radial one, and address whatever is causing the dead zone to grow after some time of gameplay. Then add dead zone options for both sticks. Smaller dead zones greatly help precision with the camera. And if players have sticks that lean, being able to raise the dead zone helps that as well. So being able to, and I think the controller global sensitivity controls these acceleration jumps. You can see it a little more. I'll make this a little more obvious by doing the exact opposite. It seems like the jump isn't quite as large at higher sensitivities, but at lower sensitivities it's much more noticeable. You can see that it's triggering right there. It'd be nice to have an option to completely disable this jump so that you can just use the curve. I haven't tested the sensitivity options fully, so I don't know if the global sensitivity controls the jump and these control your normal sensitivities. But if this just controls the jump, being able to set this to 0 or whatever to disable it is requested. So, I mean, that about covers things. There are, curve options available. That's always great to see. Oops, not aim assist, but the curves are currently wrong. So making those correct and adding more granularity would definitely radically improve the quality of this game with a gamepad, especially when it comes to consoles. Of course, I'm demonstrating this on PC where mouse and keyboard players don't care, but on console, having these issues is really gonna be a hindrance for that. But having radial dead zones and dead zone options and granular curve customization would greatly improve the controls for this game. But that covers things. So thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.